Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Hello. Oh, teacher group, that's right. We all are so keen. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Manitoba BEd Program Day. As we come together as a faculty and as committed educators, I would like to recognize and acknowledge the land on which we live and learn. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Inuit, Assinininewik, Dakota Oyate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we work as partners who are dedicated to moving forward with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Together, we gather together to deepen our understanding of our shared history, one shaped by division, injustice, and resilience. Through the lens of two Manitoba communities, we explore the lasting effects of racism and systemic inequalities on Indigenous students and their families. We read about the painful legacy of residential schools, the trauma and abuse endured by children and youth, the stories of loss and isolation, and the profound impact these experiences continue to have on generations of Indigenous students. We are honored to have the authors of Valley of the Birdtail, Andrew Stobo Sniderman and Douglas Sanderson, here today to help us engage with the issues and the themes presented in the book. The book presents a powerful and compelling narrative, one that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths and expand our understanding of reconciliation within the educational community and the school system. At its heart, Valley of the Birdtail is also a story of hope, of people coming together, acknowledging the past and walking the path of reconciliation. It is an invitation for us all as educators to be a part of that journey. So today, let us listen, learn, and reflect so that we may contribute to the future built on understanding, respect, and meaningful change. I hope that you take the teachings and lived experiences from the Valley of the Birdtail alongside today's shared knowledge as a guide for you in the classroom during your interactions with learners, families, and the community. I would like to thank our partners from the Faculty of Law for working with us and supporting today's activities. Thank you to Dr. Wayne Cerebrin, Associate Dean, Undergrad Programs and Partnerships. His vision helped us plan today, and he has worked tirelessly to create the most meaningful learning experience for you. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wayne Cerebrin, who will introduce our guests here today. Enjoy your day.
I'm absolutely thrilled to see all of us here together. Students, guests, faculty, staff, thank you. It's my privilege now to welcome our Fort Garry campus's grandmother in residence, Karen Kershane, who is bringing greetings. Grandmother Karen's traditional name is Blue Thundercloud, and she's from the Bear Clan. Grandmother Karen grew up on Seguin First Nation and later moved with her husband to Peguis First Nation. She's been a classroom teacher for over 30 years and continues to love teaching in her new role. Please welcome Grandmother Karen.
Thank you, Wayne. That was very nice. And good morning to everyone here. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm so grateful to see so many new educators. I graduated from the University of Manitoba in 1983, a long time ago. I was one of very few Indigenous teachers in the faculty at the time. And I've spent the last 30 plus years in the classroom trying to affect change, because teachers are change makers. And so as we walk through this day together, and as you walk through your education, just always remember that you are a change maker. You have the ability to create change, to change how we're doing education, to change how we're relating to each other, to change how we respond to each other. I'm so grateful to the University of Manitoba. I've only been here since the middle of September, but we're walking a path of reconciliation. And we didn't always walk this path. And I can attest to that being a former student here. But now we're walking this path. And one of the things we do that really fills my heart is that we'll pause and we'll take some time to bring ourselves together, to bring our hearts and our minds together. The university has landed on a term that we start the day in a good way. And whatever term you want to use, I invite you to use that term. You can even dare to say, we're going to pray. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm going to start this day by bringing us here together. And I'm going to say blessings upon our gathering here. Abuju, Ojoshko Banashii, Anakatishinikas, Makwandodim. Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers, we give thanks for this day. We give thanks for this gathering. We give thanks for all the young people who are sitting in this room, all the people who are going to be educating the young people. We ask for blessings upon everyone who's here. And as we navigate this day, we ask for an open heart and open mind. Because what we're going to be covering here is not going to be easy. Truth is not easy. Truth is challenging. Truth is difficult. Truth is uncomfortable. But we ask to have that open heart that we may be able to navigate the truth in a good way, in a respectful way, and in a kind way. We give thanks for everything that we've had today. We give thanks for the food, for the beautiful snow, for everything that has brought us here. We say thank you. And with that, I say miigwech. And just want to say, keep your heart open, keep your mind open, be uncomfortable, be challenged, and just be okay with all of that. And as the day moves forward, I will be available at the education building, so if you want to come and have a chat, I'm there. If you want to come and have a chat, I'm at Migizi Egamik. So I'm there for not just Indigenous students, I'm there for students. So with that, I want to say, have a good day. Miigwech.
Thank you, Grandmother Karen, for that beautiful message. And thank you, Dr. Stewart, for the opening. And I just want to thank all of our staff that have just made the day happen. So thank you. I was going to do a little bit of an introduction to the book, but I'm not going to do that now. If you do want to meet with Grandmother Karen today, if anybody is feeling some discomfort and is looking for a place of refuge today, if you come to room 223, we'll make that happen, okay? If you are a BEd student, please kindly fill in the feedback form for this session and give it to the facilitator in your 10:30 workshop back in the faculty. Okay, we've been planning this day since last spring, and there's much I would like to say about why we're beginning with the authors of the multi-award winning book, Valley of the Birdtail. But I'll let the authors and the moderators do this work for me. So I'd like to begin by introducing the two exceptional authors of the Valley of the Birdtail. First, Douglas Sanderson, Amo Binashii, is of the Beaver Clan and is from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. He's a Fulbright scholar and holds the Richard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law. Professor Sanderson has served as Senior Advisor to the Government of Ontario in the offices of the Attorney General and Aboriginal Affairs. His co-author is Andrew Stobo Sniderman. Stobo is a writer, lawyer, and Rhodes Scholar from Montreal. He came to us today from Harvard University. He has argued before the Supreme Court of Canada, served as the Human Rights Policy Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and worked for a judge of South Africa's Constitutional Court. Welcome, both of you, to Treaty 1 territory and the University of Manitoba. Now I'd like to introduce today's moderators. I'll start with Dr. Frank Deer. Dr. Deer is a professor in our Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. Frank is Ganyen Gehaga from Ganawage, a community that lies just south of Jokjoge in the eastern region of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Frank studies Indigenous language education and Indigenous religious and spiritual orientations in schools. He has previously served as a classroom teacher in northern Manitoba and in the inner city of Winnipeg. Thanks, Frank. Next, we have Amy Carpenter, and I'll pause this time. Amy is an urban Métis community member, longtime K-12 educator, and mom. Amy is in her third year of the Faculty of Education's PhD program. And then, last but not least, we have Caleb Rondo. Caleb identifies as a Métis queer music educator and performer born and raised in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. He is passionate about including Indigenous perspectives in choral music. In addition to his work as a B.Ed student, Caleb is proud to be the conductor of the Rainbow Harmony Project Youth Choir, a choir of queer, questioning, and allied youth. And as well, he is the apprentice conductor for Nuovo Se Chamber Choir. So Dr. Frank Deer is going to open the session with a brief opening statement.
Hello. Okay. Niagara, thank you very much, Wayne, and I appreciate the introduction and the navigation you had to exercise around my language. So, Niagara, thank you very much. Much appreciated. I graduated from this faculty in 1999, and Wayne was one of my professors back then, and I really appreciate the learned approach he has towards his work. So everything that I was as a teacher, and still am, frankly, is in part a result of Wayne's contribution. So Niago for all your work, Wayne. Much appreciated. So I don't want to try to put a time scale on the manner through which Indigenous education has developed over the last little while. I think it's fair to say that some of the major palpable achievements that we've made as a province and as a community, I suppose I mean Western Canada, I suppose I mean Indigenous communities across the provinces, can be captured within the last couple of decades. And some things have informed those changes in Indigenous education. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's work, which was built up to their 2015 report, which included, of course, the 94 calls to action, are one of a number of things that have informed our approach towards education. And I really appreciate Stobo and Douglas's reflections on reconciliation in their book. If you look through the introductory portions of that, it's really, really well received, and it situates your work really well. So Nyaogo for that. I had the pleasure of speaking with and bearing witness to some of the statements by the late Murray Sinclair whilst he was working with, as commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And he was posed regularly with a question something like this: what is reconciliation? And he always had this lovely turn of phrase in responding to that I think captures some of the work quite well. He said it's a journey. It's a journey toward a new relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, whilst we maintain a sense of our shared and sometimes traumatic histories. And that's really quite important. I think the theme of confrontation with those histories is really quite important to the reconciliatory journey, and it's something that I hope you consider when you're coming across the stories, the experiences, the histories, the statements, and testimonies of people who may have been there. And remember that there's always, as sometimes I say, a distance between us who wish to learn and those who had actually had to exist within that ethos of sometimes trauma. And that space, sometimes described as an ethical space, is really important to be mindful to. And it's the works such as the Valley of the Birdtail that helps to create that bridge between ourselves as learners and those who had to experience those relationships. For in-service teachers, this is becoming a really important topic of educational concern. More and more school divisions, more and more principals are considering how Indigenous education is reflected in the teachers that they ask to serve students and families. So another reason why events like this are really important is because we are attempting to condition your experiences as pre-service teachers to work within your respective schools in this important and still, in my opinion, developing area. So in an event that's intended to be as much discussion as it will be with Q&A, and Stobo did say that there can be some back and forth within this event, we hope that the reconciliatory messages that are resident within the book Valley of the Birdtail are palpable for all. So Nyaogoa, Stobo and Douglas for joining us today. Really, really appreciate this. So we do have guiding questions though. So I'm gonna ask my colleague Amy Carpenter to get us started.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Grandmother Karen, for opening this in a good way. And to Stobo and Douglas, first question, what was the impetus for writing this book? Like when, how, and why did you decide a book of this nature was needed?
Good morning. Thank you for having us, and I want to say that you've already applauded me twice, and I feel a big responsibility to earn that preemptive applause. I think maybe like some of the people in this room, I came at this as a non-Indigenous Canadian knowing, I would say, almost nothing, which is almost embarrassing because I grew up in Montreal, and when I was a child, there was, you would think, kind of unavoidable issues of tension, and there was a blockade when I was a young person that I was oblivious to, and it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that got me to confront some of these stories. And so I started reading in newspapers about these accounts, and then I decided to go attend some of the hearings. And as Professor Deere perhaps experienced himself, you know, when you hear a story, it marks you in a profound way. It marked me in a profound way, and it moved me. But I think the big step for me is to, A, spend some time learning about the past. But as I thought about residential schools, it became unavoidable to see, okay, what's happening today? In schools on reserves, where I'm sure many of you will teach, in our public schools, where I'm sure many of you will teach. And when you start paying more attention, and you have encountered or will encounter these very dramatic inequalities. And so it arouses this basic question, which is, where did this come from? And I hope this book and the people you will meet will help you have more of a context to think about these things. And so the impulse for me was just, how did we get here? And you will meet in this book people like Maureen Twovoice. You first meet her on a bus driving from her reserve to high school on a public school. And she's kind of looking around her and seeing that, you know, there's so many grade 9 students like her, and there's fewer grade 10 students, and yet fewer grade 11 students, and maybe 1 or 2 grade 12 students who are to graduate from high school. And feeling this visceral understanding that our community is not doing well or well served by this school that we're attending. You will meet people like Troy Lahoe, who is a teacher, like you will be, who attended Brandon University doing a Bachelor of Education, who graduated not that long ago, knowing nothing about residential schools or any of the issues that Professor Deere was just talking about, who thought with his friends, his fellow teachers, that it was somehow a good idea to get drunk at an old residential school that was abandoned near Brandon, which maybe some of you have even seen in the past on a tall mountain. And you see through Troy what it is to learn on this journey as someone who knows nothing, which I think is most of us, and finding a way to gently learn these issues. Because it is possible, and of course that's the point of this book, and I hope that's the point of these kinds of conversations. It's not to shame you into about what you don't know, but it's in the spirit of learning more together. And maybe I'll just conclude my answer by quoting Murray Sinclair, only because we just heard him reference. And we end the introduction to this book with this phrase that I love that he used to use, which was, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." And I think that's true. And I want to say to the question, why did we write this book? I think we wanted to write a book that was truthful, and therefore it is going to piss you off. But Douglas and I felt it was necessary to write a book that did more than that didn't just upset you, that also was about hope and about mutual understanding and about cooperation. And I hope if you follow the journey of these people, you'll find that they're good guides for us to think about these issues.
All right, I will take the next question. So throughout the story, we learned about the lives of many prominent individuals in Wayway, Sakapo, and in Rossburn. I was just wondering what the research process was to learn the stories of these people's lives and how you brought that to the story.
I might unusually just take 2 questions in a row just because I thought about it a lot about our research method. So
Also, you did all the research.
I did the interviews. I did the interviews. Okay, so I think this is true about learning in general, and maybe it's also true about research. So I hope that's why it's valuable to talk about this stuff. But you know, I was talking to Professor Deere, and he was saying, you know, this book can seem fictional as you read it, which I actually think is a great compliment, because I take that to mean it's a good story. And there's lots of details, and it feels real. And I'm happy to report it is real. These are real people. And they're using their real names. So I think it might be helpful to say that we started by asking permission from the chief and council, which they granted. We asked for permission from individual people, Maureen, Linda, Troy, Nelson. Can we talk to you about this stuff? Here's the project, here's what we're looking at. But of course it's not that simple. It's more like years of hanging out with people in their living rooms and slowly getting consent to go deeper and deeper and deeper. I think those conversations for this particular book were very sensitive to trauma, in the sense that we didn't go to traumatic places where we could avoid it, which is to say, we had a transcript that Linda Jandrew gave during interviews for a compensation legal process. So we used that instead of kind of revisiting some of the horrible stuff, because I think it is possible to do interviews about trauma, but we didn't think it was necessary, and we actually avoided it mostly in this case. We also gave people anonymity if they wanted it, and at the end, they chose that they didn't. And I think partly that's because at the very end, and actually throughout, we would share drafts and say, hey, what do you think of this? And they would say, here's a few things you could correct, and here's more stuff to make it better. Because I think as time went on, in their hearts, they hoped for a day like this, when this book would be in the hands of future teachers, and they could learn from it. And they wanted to be a part of that, and I think felt empowered by that. And I'll just conclude by saying that the book ends with an afterword by Maureen Twovoice, which some people tell me is the best part of the book. And she attended the University of Winnipeg, and she said when this book was published, this book felt like one that was written with us, not about us. And I hope that's how it reads, and I think that reflects that we tried to do it the right way.
So
So I just want to pop in for a little bit here. Morning, everybody. So I was a little bit late. Technically, I was Toronto on time. So I just want to fill in a little bit of the backstory because Stobo here is so super modest. He's lying to you. First of all, I just want to make a minor correction for his from his introduction. He mentioned there was like a little blockade down the road. That was Oka, right? So it was actually the little blockade down the road actually involved hundreds of Canadian Army soldiers surrounding a reserve. Let me also say that Stobo has been began work on Valley of the Birdtail almost 15 years ago when he was actually a student in my first year property law seminar. I was his very first professor in law school. And when you get to law school, you sort of think that you're going to get like the keys to the kingdom, right? Like things will become clear, stuff will be explained to me. And that is kind of true about some things, but not about other things. And one of the things that is not easy to understand is, like, how did we get here? Like, why is it that life on reserve is so hard? How is it possible that there's such massive inequality between Indigenous and settler people? How is it possible that the education system for Indigenous kids is so terrible? These are the questions that troubled Stobo. He would come to my office sometimes and say, like, how come we can't do something about this? And I'd be like, law, it's funny. Yeah. And while most law students after their first year, you look for a job at a law firm, and then you go there for your second summer, and then you article there, and then 40 years later you retire. That's the standard route. And Stobo didn't do that. He instead got an internship at Maclean's magazine. And while he was there, he was looking to try and explain this inequality, or at least to describe it in a comprehensive way. And that's when he stumbled upon the story of Rossburn and Wayway. And he wrote an article about the town then, and followed up a couple of years later. And then more or less moved to Rossburn and Wayway for many summers and slept in people's couches and basically lived there. And then went to Ottawa and to Winnipeg and worked in the archives for weeks and weeks and weeks on end in the dusty materials. And so when you read Valley and you see all of those footnotes, I should mention to you too that the job of a book editor, it turns out, isn't to make your book better, it's to make it shorter. And so they were like 40,000 words of footnotes. No, can't do that. So what's there is about 10,000 words of footnotes, but there's significantly more that was done. And that was all the research that Stobo did in the background to make this project possible. I came into it significantly later, much towards the end. And so I just also want us to take a moment maybe to just applaud Stobo's incredible work doing the research here. He needs many applause lines. He's come from a long ways away. So anyway, with that as a background, thanks so much. Chuck, more.
Okay, can I forgive me for responding to his addition? But I want to compliment Douglas now. No, I'm just joking. But I want to get to something that Douglas, I thought, was going to say, which is that this book and this project this journey, I think, is something that is a collaborative project. I love that we're actually sharing a mic so we can't talk over each other, which I think is actually kind of fitting. And so I just want to underline, yeah. I just want to underline that this book could not have been written by either one of us. As charming and brilliant as Douglas is, and as hard as I want it to work, it's not a subject that we can do alone or pursue alone. And I want to emphasize that that didn't come to me immediately. That humility was not obvious to me at first, but it becomes obvious the longer you work on these issues. I think that it's a collaboration, and that you can enrich it by working together. And so the words that you read have literally gone through dozens and dozens of revisions through both of our minds and our experiences. And we could talk about some of how that looks like, but it's like this constant argument or collaboration that Douglas and I have had, and I hope, because we're very different people. I love him, and I don't know if he loves me back, but we've done this through both of ourselves, and it had to be true to both of us. And I think to the extent that the book and the story feels true, it's because it went through both of us.
Yeah, for that. Really do appreciate that. I hope we can hover over a phenomenon that no doubt you had to confront, and I've borne witness to amongst our BEd students in the past. And maybe the mention of the Oka crisis is a way of approaching this, because I happened to be there. I was 15 years old during the summer of the Oka crisis, and I won't bore you too much with the details. It's a bit distraction now, but living under military occupation for months, for which food wasn't really crossing into the community and other supplies. Sound familiar? Can be a bit of a toll on the community, I'll put it lightly, like that. But I was 15 years old, and I was a part of a community of youth and children who were themselves learners in their respective school contexts. And there is possibly the need to confront this after the fact with their teachers, with other community members, especially if they went outside the community like I did for school. That might be really quite important. So in coming to enter into relationships with people for which you can get some learning, the research that you did, and maybe this is resident in the collaboration you had with Douglas. Is there anything to be said about that approach toward the work? Did you have to situate yourself within the cultural contexts? Was there protocols in place? Were there things that you felt you needed to do, or you came to learn you needed to do, in order to learn specifically about those stories? And I ask that question because I've seen, as I said before, our own BEd students who wish to do work within their BEd programs and wish to do some work within their schools and need to develop relationships like that. I'm wondering if you could hover over that point a bit.
Yeah, that's quite a tough question, but a kind of an essential question. People in this audience can feel whether what I say is right, but the sense I get as a non-Indigenous person who's interested and caring about these issues is that at this point, there's a lot of reluctance by would-be allies to get involved. Because maybe you think it's not my place to ask that question or to do that work. And so you kind of drift to the sidelines and think, oh, you know what? Let me let my Indigenous colleagues do the work. Take the space. Speak. And I think often to something that a teacher in northern Manitoba told me, which was an Indigenous teacher looking at me saying, we need allies, not saviors. So I think we need to discard, of course, the idea that as a non-Indigenous person, you should be charging in to save these poor people from themselves and from the rest of us, and taking all the space. Let's put that to one side. The time for that was never, and it's over. But the answer is not to cede all the space, because you may have noticed that your Indigenous colleagues are tired of doing all this work themselves. I see that in the burden that Douglas has as a professor at the University of Toronto. They're like, hey, who's the Indigenous guy who can chair this committee or teach this class or welcome these students and chair these conversations? It's a lot, and it's tiring. And even as amazing they are, they can't do all the work. It's like saying, hey, America, leave it to the black people to fix your anti-black racism. I think that's a fundamental mistake. And us non-Indigenous people need to realize that we're a part of this and that there are respectful ways to engage, and I think we must. And what we're trying to do with a book like this is not to make you feel bad about the past, it's to make you feel more responsible for the future. And so my experience, which I hope is reflective of what you will experience, is if you approach the work with humility, please take that first step. And you will find, overwhelmingly, that people will welcome you. Not to kind of teach you everything and to hold your hand every time, but to say, yes, you're welcome to be part of this journey. In fact, allies can help. And in fact, there's lots of non-Indigenous people who need to be persuaded by non-Indigenous people. So I encourage you, I implore you to have the courage to not be on the sidelines if you think you're interested or you want to be a part of this. And I think we've got to be a part of this. So I hope you join me and us in working on this. And I'll just give one very practical example about working with Douglas, for example. I think I make bumbling mistakes every week on these issues. I didn't mean any offense by referring to a little blockade. I hope I didn't say little blockade, but if I did, it was the Oka crisis. It affected your life in a profound way, so maybe that was such a stumble. But anyway, I make mistakes all the time. And I'm lucky enough, and I hope you're lucky enough to have friends like Douglas to be your partner in this. And if you approach the work with humility and commitment, they will emerge. And I wrote a part of a draft for chapter 2 about Linda Jandrew, which maybe we'll talk more about, or maybe not. And this is the chapter that focuses on residential schools. And I was deep in these archives, and I wrote a draft which included the word, I'm going to spell it out because I literally cannot say it anymore, SAVAGE. Like people were saying that in the historical materials, and I just kind of like absorbed it. And I wrote this out and I shared it with Douglas, and he was like, I think you're overusing that word. And in fact, it hurts me to read that word. And so I'm not saying don't use it, but you use it judiciously. Use it if you have to. And so I think now it literally comes up once. And I think that's a good example of me not seeing something and another different person seeing that, and the two of us thinking about it together, making it better.
Thanks so much, Stobo. So I teach a class at the law school now called Indigenous Legal Traditions and the Imperial Response, which is a good name. And it's the imperial response part that is really the interesting part. Well, the indigenous legal tradition stuff, super fascinating. It's like the first 2/3 of the course, and it's super awesome, and everyone loves it. And then we switch, and we start looking at Europe. What did Europe make of the indigenous encounter? What do they think about that? And somehow, maybe in grade school, we all sort of learned this really simple story. And we didn't even really learn a story. We sort of were fed a narrative that just sort of said something like, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then he arrived in North America, and then, I don't know, we built cities and the Indians went away, something? Confederation. So my class looks at that sort of period between 1500 and Confederation. What was going on there? And what's interesting to have discovered and to teach now is that that is totally not true. That in fact, Europeans and indigenous peoples work together quite closely. They allied themselves under a series of important treaties, like the Covenant Chain, for example. And within these traditions, they did their best to learn each other's languages and marry into each other's families and learn each other's traditions and really work to try and be neighbors. What's important, I think, to understand, and what's hard to believe, is that all the bad stuff, the residential schools, the broken treaties, the bad promises, the crappy allies, all of that, that's all after Confederation in Canada. It's all after the American Revolution in the US. Before that, we're really dealing with nation-to-nation relationships. And I bring this up because I think it can be hard as a non-Indigenous person to bear the weight of 500 years of guilt, right? To just imagine that I am responsible in the present day for half a millennia of greed and destruction. And you're not. I mean, you never were. I think it's important that we here and now see that colonialism has never been our problem. We were never really a colony. And when we were kind of a colony, things were mostly okay. Then Confederation, right? That's when this young government decides that it has all these national projects. That's when they forget about the treaties. That's when they turn their backs on their allies. And so the problem that we face today, the situation that we're in, this is not colonialism, this is just nationalism. And that means that the wrongs that we don't have to look back 500 years to try and right the past. It's too much, no one can do that anyway. What we're talking about is basically 7 generations, 150 years. And that is something that we can turn around. Starting now, if we dig in. These are not like intractable problems that we've been left with for half a millennia. This is something, within a couple of generations of living memory. Which is not to say that it's easy or quick, but I don't want anyone walking out of here thinking that you bear this historical burden, right? Like, none of that stuff is your fault. You didn't do any of that. It is, however, true that we, all of us in the present day, are somehow living the benefits of some of those wrongs, and so it's incumbent upon us to act and to do something. Reconciliation means something. We have to act. But I want us to understand that this problem that we have, this inequality, this is something that we made, and this is something that we can undo. It is within our power to act. And so I just want us all to understand that although we're talking about big and really hard things, some of which happened a long time ago, it didn't happen that long ago. And hard things can be patched up, and relations can be mended, and we can actually get to where we're going as long as we stay focused on the goal, which is how can we live together as neighbors the way we once did a very long time ago. But we can get there again. We just need to try. Thanks.
All right, I'll take the next question again. So as a student who has Indigenous studies as one of my teachable subjects, in my classes throughout my degree, I've learned about the atrocities of residential schools and how discriminatory policies have affected Indigenous peoples. But when I was going through the book, Valley of the Birdtail, one thing that really struck me was the way that knowing that these are real people, seeing their names, seeing the images that you've included in the story, really made me feel more of a personal connection to these events. So I was wondering, what was the decision that led you to the decision to involve these personal stories with also historical fact? And also, as a future educator, how could we take this idea into a future classroom and use it in our teaching practice?
So let me deal with the second part first. I have no idea. We're not educators, so we don't know how to do education stuff. So just...
You were my teacher.
I'm sorry, yeah. I was making it up. So I maybe just want to talk a little bit about, you've probably read a lot of books about Indigenous-settler stuff. And our experience of reading those same books is that while they are powerful, they often make me just sad. And then they leave me there. They just walks away. Now, I think as an Indigenous person, I think what's going on there is that our authors, our artists, want to try and transfer to you as readers something of their experience of the world. And that experience of the world is quite shitty. It hurts. It's painful. And so they can try and make you feel some of that. And often they succeed. But we didn't really want to do that at all. We knew we were going to have to cover sort of very hard material, but we wanted to leave you with a notion of hope. But I want to we'll talk about hope later. I want to talk for just a little bit about the hard stuff. And in the book, as you know, and Stobo mentioned, in chapter 2, quite early on, we take on the residential school experience, which in society of late has loomed so large that it sort of blotted out a lot of the other injustices, right, which we spend a lot more time on in Valley of the Birdtail. But the residential school experience is so important. Right? It's like a fundamental driver of what's happening in our communities today. It's, in the book, it's the relationship between Linda Jandrew and her daughter, Maureen Truevoice. And that relationship is in many ways very broken. And I think it's important to see that it's broken because parenting is not something that we go to school for, right? We don't take classes in it. We just sort of have the experience of having had parents. And then when we become parents, we just model that behavior. And now imagine 7 generations of kids who never experienced parenting at all. And now they have kids. Turns out they're really terrible parents. But, I mean, it's not their fault. They just have no idea how to do it. So Linda is that character for us. And when thinking about how to tell her story, as Stobo said, we had access to a lot of legal documents. We know a lot of stuff about Linda's life, a lot of very personal stuff about Linda's life. But when it came time to tell her story and the story of residential schools, we were left with really not the question of what to put in, but what to take out. Like, how can we tell the story truthfully and in a way that reflects the actual impact of the experience for Linda? And so what we do is we just tell one story. And it's not even a very long story. The story takes place one morning. You will recall when Linda is late for breakfast. She hasn't been there very long. She's forgot her shoes. She runs back to get her shoes or is trying to decide whether she should. Anyway, the nun spots her without her shoes and then just immediately crosses the hall to her and then pow, right across Linda's ear. And that experience leaves her without hearing in that ear for the rest of her life. And so this little tiny story about residential schools, about one breakfast, about one incident, we think allows us to show how that experience carries forward into the present day, that harm she physically carries with her every day. She's never able to hear again out of that ear. She is scarred by that experience. And so we want to be able to tell these stories of people's lives. But what we learned along the way, I think, is that you can tell a little bit of a story and convey the whole story. Because as important as residential schools is to our understanding of the Indigenous-settler relationship, it really, really is not the only wrong. It's in some ways the most terrible and understandable wrong, but it's not the only one. And our point in trying to tell this whole story is that there's a remedy at the end of this. There's a way to make this right. But the solutions that we want to talk about don't make any sense if all you know about this story is that there were residential schools. You have to be able to see this huge arc of injustice beginning at the beginning. And when you follow that through from the beginning all the way to the present day, then you're able to look back and think like, wow, we need to change some things, right? Residential schools, as important as they are, have come to take up all the oxygen of the story. You know, it's deeply affected our community, my own family. But it's not the whole story. And the characters in the book, the real people in the book, they convey the story, the historical narrative for us, and we want to be respectful of that. And so dealing with Linda, dealing with the residential school experience is something we can do in a really small way, but in a way that we hope still leaves you feeling something of Linda's experience of what it is to be her in the world today.
Can I just add a couple little points? One of them is to say simply that I think we learn through story. I think that's the best way to learn. And I'm sure that's empirically true, but I think good teachers are good storytellers. And I hope good teaching material are good stories. And the second point is just to echo what Douglas was just saying. It just occurred to me that we often talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But sometimes I think implicitly we forget that it was the TRC on Indian residential schools. And somehow the TRC has come to represent the totality of the truth that we need to confront to do reconciliation. As Douglas says, they're just a piece, an important piece, these schools, but there is a much bigger story there. And so there's more truth, and in this book we give some more of that. And so the project is much bigger, and I think actually the TRC's calls to action gesture towards that bigger conversation. And I want to just get at a part of your question, which was about the importance on focusing on individuals and kind of diving into specific lives. And for me, what I hope you get out of going deeply with a specific story is you get more ambiguity. The closer you look, I think the more complicated it gets. And you have to ask yourself things like, you know, how racist is Troy or Nelson? What do we make of a guy like Michael Two-Voice, who is ambiguous? And I think the ambiguity is very, very important. I think you may have observed, as I have observed, that in work on these issues, it's very easy to be righteous. It's easy to label people as racist, and then people get defensive, and I think people are quick, some people are very too quick to judge and to criticize. And part of what we're doing in this book, I hope, is to try to be fair to people and to show actually people are complicated and people can change. And if we lose sight of that, then I don't think we're going to be very good at having a conversation. And I said earlier that I wanted to kind of speak to some of the reluctant allies. And I hope this book, in a way, is reaching out to another group of people, which is kind of like the skeptical people in this room in our country, who are like kind of tuning out this reconciliation talk, who think that we are reaching too far, that we're too righteous, that we're too quick to kind of cast off the deplorable racists, who it turns out is like a lot of us. And I want to say to the skeptics, and I hope the book says to the skeptics, that like, I see you too. And I care about your point of view. And I care about changing your mind. But that's why Douglas and I think, spend a lot of time trying to understand a guy like Nelson Lahoe, who was a teacher in the Manitoba public school system his whole life and never had a real conversation with an Indigenous person, even though they were literally his neighbors. And late in life, he comes to actually have interactions with Indigenous people and students as a part-time adult ed teacher, and it kind of happens by accident, as you'll see. And at the age of 67 or 68, for the first time, he actually has to start interrogating his own prejudices. And I think he's important because he's a lot of the people in my family, he's a part of me, I think he's a part of a lot of us, which is the person who like we could quickly dismiss, but actually is important to try to understand, to bring along in this work. And I also ask the people who are skeptical, you know, you're worth understanding and being, and I show a lot of empathy, I hope, in this book for people who are starting way on one side, and there's gotta be a way for us to come closer together. If we listen to each other, I think we're able to persuade each other of a lot.
Yeah, okay. So when I read the book a couple of times, the first 3/4 of the book, I would say, was a lot of truth-telling. And then the fourth section, partnership, kind of gets into a path of how do we do this tangible actions together. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because I feel like I've heard a lot of the truth-telling, I've been immersed into a lot of the truth-telling, but it's the partnership piece that I need some direction on.
Thanks so much. So, yeah, thank you. We spent a lot of time sort of laying out the history and very little time talking about the future. But one of the things that we've noticed is that thinking about the future is not something a lot of people have been doing. That one of the reasons why this feels so hard, I think, is because we haven't really expended any imagination towards the future, and so it seems like all we have is this really hurtful, crappy present, and all we're doing is digging up more pain in the past and facing it. We wanted to offer the possibility of something different, and I think that, I want to take some responsibility from on behalf of Indigenous academics and activists. We have been saying the same thing for 100 years, and it's been a real simple message about wanting our land back, for example. And what I have come to realize is that we're not really asking for things that we really want. Land is, it turns out, different than stuff. Stuff you can give back. It's real easy. You just put it in a box, put it in the mail, send it off. Done. Land, you can't get your arms around it. It's way too big. You can't actually give it back. And so what we should be talking about is jurisdiction. Who has lawmaking authority over various tracts of land? When people say land back, I have spoken to enough of my settler colleagues to realize that what they hear is, I want my land back and get the fuck off my land. And that's really frightening to people. And it's unfair as well to people. And it's not even what we want. I don't care about your ranch. I just want your tax money. I want to make the laws. I want to decide where the roads get built, right? And so what we try and do towards the end of the book is to sort of reorient some of the ways that we think and talk about that future. And as it turns out, we've been running in Canada for quite a while a series of experiments about how to do this in the form of modern-day comprehensive treaty agreements, which we do in British Columbia and the Yukon and to a lesser extent northern Quebec. But these are agreements that provide those nations with land and some money to get you started, and then just control over the land. And then there's no more Indian affairs, there's no more money coming from the federal government. You're just you are a government with territory, and you make decisions about what happens there, and you tax that activity, and then you use that money to build schools and fire departments and all the stuff that local governments do. And we do that kind of routinely in Canada now. It happens in the background, and it doesn't really affect most of us, so we don't really talk about it. But we sort of have all of the tools that we need as a nation to really begin to affect these kinds of solutions. They're not impossible. We don't need a constitutional convention, even. We don't need to do that hard work. We just need agreements between the federal government and the province. And the reality is, though, that this is not free, right? That there is a cost that comes with it, and we also want to talk about that because it shouldn't come as a surprise to people that there'll be a cost. We want to pay attention to how can we minimize that cost? How can we realize that it's there, but then also absorb it? And so we talk about mechanisms for First Nations communities to be able to give back into the larger provincial or federal coffers to minimize the blow, because this is an expensive project. And again, we have all been benefiting from the wrongs of the past, and so, it is probably time we coughed up a little bit. But the stuff that we talk about at the end of the book is not, it's not new, it's not experimental, it's stuff that we've done all of the time, stuff that we can do. And we all, I think, need to realize, we're both lawyers. So there's a way in which it's easy to think that these are really complicated legal problems and some lawyers in the Supreme Court will sort it out, but we're not gonna. Because these are not legal problems, these are political problems. And political problems require political solutions. And that's where you come in. That's where we all come in. Our political leaders are not just gonna decide they're gonna fix that thing. They're not gonna do that. They're not gonna do that until we ask them to. And so what we're trying to do towards the end of the book is to motivate you to ask those questions of our political leaders. What's the solution? What's the plan? And if they say something like, well, we'd like to increase funding, we're trying to offer you the tools to say, no, really, what's the actual plan? Because that's not it, right? The structural change that we're trying to advocate for at the end of the book is the kind of structural change that comes about as the result of a political movement of concerned citizens expressing themselves to their political leaders. And when enough of us do that, they will act, and we will generate that change. But until we believe in the possibility of a better future, until we actually start advocating for it, it is not going to arrive. The Supreme Court is not going to fix this. This is literally up to us, as it has been for 7 generations, for 150 years. We can turn this thing around, but we actually have to do something about it. And the something is to be active citizens engaged in the issues and engaged in the politics of the day.
I'm going to just intervene here just a bit. I think we need to hear the voices of our students. So I welcome you to come up to the mic if you have a question for our authors. This would be a good time. Thank you.
Hello.
Yay.
Good morning.
It's a lot of pressure when you get applauded first.
I know, it's terrifying. Okay, I learned a lot from the book. I also thought that the timeline of the book was really interesting, starting with Marine and then going back and then taking another step back and then in the middle, then starting moving forward. And I was just curious on the why on constructing the book like that.
Thank you for that. What was your name?
Oh, my name's Marin.
Hi, Marin.
Hi.
Thank you. What's funny about that is that we shifted the timeline completely about a week before the manuscript was submitted because it turns out the people who are alive and you've talked with for years, they can give you more material that makes it more engaging. And so that's why we started in the present, because we wanted to kind of dive you in. And maybe you can agree that the historical material from the 1800s and early 20th century, maybe it's a bit drier because there's not enough stuff that you know, and Douglas and I didn't want to make up stuff. And so that's why it's structured the way it is. But the goal, in some way, is to kind of give a history of education in our country, and every character is there to kind of represent a stage in this longer story of residential schools, integrated education in public schools, which I don't think we talk a lot about in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, which was a catastrophe. And then the retreat back to on-reserve schools, and now to the present day, which is where you're going to teach, where it's kind of a mix of both, where there's a lot of on-reserve schools in Manitoba, like other places, and there's a lot of integrated settings where I hope we're at least trying to do better than the integrated schools did 3 or 4 decades ago. So purely to tell the best possible story as the way it's designed that way.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi there. Stobo and Douglas, thank you so much for coming today. My question for you gets at the idea that you discussed about ambiguity that arises in complex histories. Those who have read Valley of the Birdtail understand that Michael Touvois, a once staunch reformist of the Indian Act, eventually changed his tune and complied with Canadian assimilation policies. He felt that this was the best chance to provide his children with a future. Since I'm not in a position to judge this decision, I struggle to make sense of his legacy. Based on your experience, how has he been remembered in Rossburn and Waiwasakapo?
I'm going to let Stobo deal with the how is he remembered part. I think Michael Touvois is sort of an unsung hero of the book, in part because, and Michael Touvois is an inspiration to me, because he reminds me that things are not easy or simple. And, in my academic life and in my academic career, I have become, a bit of a contrarian. And like Michael Touvois, for example, my colleagues will say, we need to get rid of the Indian Act. Let's get rid of the Indian Act. Get rid of the Indian Act. Which is awesome, but so what? Like, what's next, right? Like, that's the thing that's important. Saying get rid of the Indian Act is the easy part, right? And this goes back to this earlier trope of mine about how we Indigenous academics and activists need to think more clearly about the claims we are making. We don't want to get rid of the Indian Act. We want to end the oppression that's in the Act. But if there's going to be a special relationship between Canadians, Aboriginal populations, Indians, and the state, that's going to be set out in a statute. Right? There's going to be some kind of a statutory instrument that governs that relationship. So the idea that we should just get rid of the Indian Act authorizes things like the construction of schools on Indian reserves, right? Do we want to get rid of that too? Like, I don't think so. Michael Touvois reminds us that these claims that we make standing in our soapbox are not connected to reality. The issues are more complicated than that. We need to be more nuanced than that. And in fact, we've had 150 years to think this thing through. You'd think we'd be further along than we are. But Michael reminds us that the claims are not easy to make, that we need to think about what we're asking for. And it's not, I think, that in the end, Michael Touvois complies with the Indian Act. It's the way you put it. I think that Michael Touvois realizes that he has a life to live, and there are certain constraints around that, and he's just going to operate within that system. Now, it's a limiting system, and it's unfair to Michael. But I think at some point, Michael realized he was not going to get rid of the Indian Act. That was not going to happen in his lifetime. And so he chooses to operate within the structure that's available to him. He questions the structure. He asks the good questions. And I think in that way, Michael Tuvois models for us how it is we should understand what it is we're trying to do here, that it's not easy, it's not simple. Just standing on your soapbox and yelling stuff does not help. We need to actually really think through what it is we're trying to do, and we need to ask those questions. We need to, don't get rid of the idea. We need to change the relationship between First Nations and the Crown. That's what we want to do. Right? The Indian Act, or some version of it, is still going to be there to moderate that relationship. And just getting rid of it is easy to say, it's catchy, and as an Indigenous person, it's fun. I'm right when I say that, ha-ha, it feels good, but it doesn't help. And I think, if we're gonna generate the kind of change that we need to generate, we actually need to think clearly about the claims, that we need to think like Michael Tuvois, that the things that are easy to ask for are not necessarily the things that I want or need.
Thanks, Douglas, and thank you for this question. I think Michael Tuvois is the most interesting person in this book because he's the most ambiguous, and I don't think I'm comfortable directly answering how he's remembered. I'm not sure, but I think maybe we should remember that at the end of his life, he did come to say, you know what, we do need a separate school that's outside of the Manitoban provincial system on reserve because that gives us the best chance for our children. And so he kind of changed his mind. And maybe for me, what's important, part of what's important about his story is that he faced impossible choices. It was either day schools that are horrifically underfunded, run by a couple missionaries, or an assimilationist public school system. And faced with that choice, he said, you know what? I think or residential school, I think I'd rather my kids go to the public school down the road. And later on in his life, he had to face the failure of Manitoba's public schools for Indigenous students and came to support the on-reserve school. And if we fast forward one generation until quite recently, the choice that communities on reserve in Manitoba had to face until the last couple of years was, do you want a separate on-reserve system, which is horrifically underfunded, and let's remind ourselves what that means. It means you get paid less as a teacher, it means you don't have all the materials, you do not have all the extra supports that public schools have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or do you want to send your kids into an environment in the public school where they are not welcome? And I think it is sobering to realize how many communities said, you know what, it's unfair, but we'd rather be separate. So we need to re-examine, all of us, the terms of quote-unquote integration. I think it's the wrong word, but it's more like, what is the choice that we're offering Indigenous students in this province? Can we make public schools more welcoming and places where Indigenous students can flourish? Yes, that is the challenge. And at the same time, is it important to offer a meaningful opportunity on reserves to have schools that are different? Yes, and I think we kind of need to pursue both of these projects at the same time, and I think his life prompts us to think about that.
Thank you.
And thank you both for those really great questions. Thank you. Frank was going to end with a statement, but I'm worried about time and fairness to your workshop facilitators in the next section. So I'm going to ask you, I know you've been sitting a long time and I appreciate that, but I am going to ask you if you would exercise by walking back to the Faculty of Education and trying to get back to your session for 10:30, if that's possible. I want to thank the moderators, the Amy and Caleb and Frank, and our two authors, Douglas and Stobo. Thank you.